the digits of pi, and 15-cent scholarship for those who can recite the most digits of pi. But Randy has just reminded us that Pi Day is coming up soon, through March 14, so make sure that you get your pie ready. He eats pie on Pi Day every year, so I thought we'd start with that PSA. There you go, Randy, we'll start a little thing.
And I always got mad at my mom because I was born on the 16th.
Oh, you wanted to be born on Pi Day.
But then I was already 2 months and 1 week preemie, so maybe another 2 days I would not make it.
Well, you know, Randy, I make fun of my dad. My dad's a physicist, and I tell him when we get to heaven, they're gonna learn maybe what they got right and wrong. And maybe when we get to heaven, we'll learn that Pi Day was on the 16th. Who knows? Who knows? Who knows, right? You never know. But good morning, happy Sabbath. Happy Sabbath. It's beautiful outside. I love this time of year, the fight between winter and spring, right? Bulbs are starting to come up. We've got wind, promise of rain, all kinds of things happening. But let's pray over this Sabbath day and dive into our verses for today. Does anyone want to pray for us this morning? It's my habit to ask for volunteers. Would anyone like to pray? You can do it. All right, let's bow our heads. Father God, thank you. Thank you for Sabbath. Thank you for the chance to gather with others and dig into your scriptures. Thank you for this beautiful back and forth weather and the promise of spring. Thank you for the promise of good food and relaxation on your day. Lord, we invite you to be here with us. Help us not to waste this celebration today. In your name we pray. Amen. All right, today we're in Acts 14. So pull it up. We're gonna hear about Paul and Barnabas's great mission trip. Here at Walla Walla, we have a student missions crew. We've got a bunch of student missionaries out in the field right now, and they come back every year, and we have a little celebration for them. And so it's with that mentality. How many of you were missionaries, student missionaries? All right, with that mentality, let's think about Paul and Barnabas on the great mission trip that we read about in Acts 14. Do you want to read us in, James? Okay. 14.
At Iconium, Paul and Barnabas went as usual into the Jewish synagogue. There they spoke so effectively that a great number of Jews and Greeks believed. But the Jews who refused to believe stirred up the other Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. So Paul and Barnabas spent considerable time there, speaking boldly for the Lord, who confirmed the message of his grace by enabling them to perform signs and wonders. The people of the city were divided. Some sided with the Jews, others with the apostles. There was a plot afoot among both Gentiles and Jews, together with their leaders, to mistreat them and stone them. But they found out about it and fled to Lycaonian cities of Lystra and Derbe, and to the surrounding country, where they continued to preach the gospel. At Lystra and Derbe, in there sat a man who was lame. He had been that way from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul as he was speaking. Paul looked directly at him and saw that he had faith to be healed, and called out, "Stand to your feet." At that, the man jumped up and began to walk. When the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in human form." Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought bulls and wreaths to the city gates because he and the crowd wanted to offer sacrifice to them. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of this, they tore their clothes and rushed out to the crowd, shouting, "Friends, why are you doing this? We too are only human like you. We are bringing good news telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God, who made the heavens and earth and the seas and everything in them. In the past, he let all nations go their own way. Yet he has not left himself without testimony. He has shown the kindness by giving you rain from heaven and the crops in their seasons. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your heart with joy. Even with these words, they had difficulty keeping the crowd from sacrificing to them. Then some Jews came from Antioch and Iconium and won the crowd over. They stoned Paul and dragged him outside the city, thinking he was dead. But after the disciples had gathered around him, he got up and went back into the city. Next day, he and Barnabas left for Derbe. They preached the gospel in that city and won a large number of disciples. They returned to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch, strengthening the disciples and encouraging them to remain true to the faith. We must go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God, they said. Paul and Barnabas appointed elders for them in each church, and with prayer and fasting committed them to the Lord in whom they had put their trust. After going through Pisidia, they came to Pamphylia, and when they had preached the word in Perga, they went down to Attila. From Attila, they sailed back to Antioch, where they had been committed to the grace of God for the work they had now completed. On arriving there, they gathered the church together and reported all that God had done through them and how he had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles. And they stayed there a long time with the disciples.
That's a lot. Acts 14 is the tale of a 2-year missionary journey. What were you doing 2 years ago? That's how long this took. And I tried, because I'm pretty tangible when I learn, I tried to figure out what this looked like. And I've tried to draw it. Apologies, I'm sure some of you are way better than this. But this is southern Turkey right here. Okay, and here's a little island with Cyprus on it, okay, in the sea. So they started at Antioch, they went over here, Cyprus, went up into southern Turkey, came around. Iconium plays a starring role in this story. Lystra plays a starring role in this story. They came over here to Derbe, and then what'd they do? They turned around and went back. Only on their way home, they skipped Cyprus, they just sailed straight to Antioch. 1,400 miles, that's 100 miles less than going to Oklahoma City from Walla Walla. It's a lot. 2 years. And what do we know about kind of what they were doing? They were preaching, right? And what was their habit? What jumps out at you as we read these verses? What jumps out? What appears to be their habit as they're traveling? Where do they preach?
Synagogue.
Okay, they start with the synagogue, right? They start with the synagogue. How does that go? You think? Do they stay in the synagogue? Do they stay there? Do we know?
It said they went out in the countryside and other places within it, so I suspect they moved around as it's described. But they started with the Jews to begin with, which would be the social.
And just like the verses before this, what have we sort of been reading? Are these guys getting an overwhelming welcome? At first, and then what happens?
They get stoned.
They get pestered. I mean, you don't really go from 0 to stoning, I'm sure. Humankind has plenty of stops in between. What must that have been like? Tell me what you imagine in order to be stoned. Like what could have taken place there? We know that the Jews were a little grumpy, yeah.
I feel like what they arrive at a new place, they're the latest craze, right, showing up until somebody in a leadership position feels threatened. And then it goes downhill from there. So in other words, similar to Jesus and his interactions with the leaders, the Jewish leaders, once they feel threatened, all of a sudden the shine is worn off and we need to get rid of them.
Anyone experience that? I'll tell you, as an administrator at Walla Walla University, I can tell you that there are lots of parents that have concerns. So can you imagine, you know, Paul and Barnabas, sort of the cool youth pastors for a while, maybe, and parents saying, I don't know what they're teaching my kids. wanna make sure my son can go to synagogue, I don't know what's going on here, townspeople saying what's happening. Imagine the amount of pestering or conversation that must have taken place to incite people to try to stone them, right? What else jumps out at you about what they were doing, what they were up to? Yes,
I'm very curious on this healing of this crippled man. What's really curious to me is Paul saw that he had faith to be healed, and I'm thinking, what does that look like? What did Paul see that he saw that he had faith to be healed? I don't know.
oh, that's a good question. How would Paul know, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's what my translation says. After looking directly at him and seeing that he had faith to be healed. What does that look like?
Can you imagine as part of your ministry, walking up to someone and saying, stand up, you're healed? No. Imagine how that must have felt. What else jumps out at you about what they were doing? Yeah,
They were preaching the gospel, that's.
preaching the gospel. Now, we need to remember what has happened in the past, right? Paul has had an amazing conversion story. He would have been present probably when Stephen was stoned. Was he on, which side was he on at that time? He might have been among those who threw a stone, right? Okay, so he's had an amazing conversion story and he's preaching that all over the place with Barnabas, right? Yes.
Could we say he was a legalist at that point? Would that be a fair statement?
Could have been, or threatened, or,
Well, he felt that God destroys. And therefore I can destroy to get you in shape. I would call that, to me, a description of legalist.
and we've talked about that, but I talked about this, but I wanna go back to it. What would have happened in Saul's life to flip him so dramatically? What happened? What's he preaching about? Is he preaching about the rules and like what's happening in him? Yes.
No, I was just gonna say what's happening is interesting that in chapter 13. That he pronounced the same problem on Elymas, who is a false worker. The blindness, okay, this is what changed my life, and bingo, you've got the same malady.
He seems to have an understanding of what was and what
What
is.
needs to happen.
Yeah. Jesus, right? The resurrection of Jesus. Messiah. Grace, all these things. He was preaching the gospel. Okay. Anything else that jumps out? I thought of something this week that I want to chat about, but we'll get there in a minute. Yes, here and then here.
And one thing, they made sure, no, it's not us, we're just like you, we're just giving God the glory,
Okay, so selfless,
selfless.
pointing to Jesus. Okay. Paul isn't out to create a whole new church with him at the lead, right? Yes, oh, no, right here and then here.
I wanted to step back, this is a mission trip. I think a mission trip says, you're going somewhere. You look different potentially from the people that you're attending to. You may not know their language. I'm curious, would the recipients of this gospel, would they notice or that, was it a different language? Did they look different
Would they have noticed them as outsiders?
as outsiders? And if they all of a sudden miraculously spoke their language, was that yet another testament to what had happened in this week?
They would have known that they were not from there, surely, especially as we get up in here. From my reading, these are not big towns. This isn't Seattle. I mean, these are little towns. I kind of extrapolated like 1,000 people kind of towns, little towns. Batesburg, Touchy, you know, out in the rural area of southern Turkey. Okay, yes.
It does seem like Paul has that, we'll call it a similar insight to where Jesus would look at a crowd of people and would see well beyond their physical need. And probably from that blessing that God has given him in that mission, he can see, well, so when it talks about seeing a lame man and seeing the faith, I kind of view that as almost literal. He could see the man's faith, much like Jesus could.
Pretty amazing. All right, anything that you want to share that strikes you about Paul? Because I want to take a little bit of a hard turn away from Paul.
Yeah, the thought of how Paul changed, you know, from let's keep the rules because that'll make God happy. He changed to a different picture of God altogether. And in Romans 1:16, he says, I am not ashamed of the gospel because it is the power of God for salvation to everybody who believes. So he has a different picture coming up. And in the gospel, then it goes on, for in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. So he's changed his picture somehow of what God is like. And then in the middle of the chapter 14 there, when they're trying to make Paul and Barnabas into gods, he says, we too are only men, humans like you. We bring you good news. Paul's telling people about God, how good God is, how he had changed and understood God's character difference. As he goes on, he says, we are bringing you the good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God who made the heavens and earth and seas and everything in them. He's painting a different picture because it changed his life.
And it's not about him, is it?
No.
He's deflecting. They go out of their way to deflect. This is a perfect segue. Let's leave Paul behind for a bit. He and Barnabas are the star of the show. This is their mission trip. That's great. I want to focus on some other characters. And I would submit to you that there are three groups that we should focus on today. Okay, the first group we find at the beginning of 14. So 14 through somewhere around 6, 14, 1 through 5. Tell me about that group. I want to talk about groups today. What do we know about that group in the first 5 verses of 14? If that group was a character in a play, a character in a production, tell me about that group, yes.
So they were the Jews that accepted Paul's message, but they turned right around to start messing with how that message was interpreted by the Gentiles.
Okay, so this was a Jewish group and they were all right until what? You said they accepted Paul's message and then it was like, wait a minute, not these guys. Not these other, okay?
Into it, as they call them unbelieving Jews.
Unbelieving Jews, okay? All right, what else do we know about the groups that are mentioned? It's diverse, say more about that.
Says Jews and Greeks, and then in my version here, it says the Jews who refused to believe stirred up the other Gentiles. So I'm assuming that it's not just the Jews and the Greeks.
What do you have to be like to stir stuff up? Think about this. What is this group like? Are they connected? Right? I might say that they have friends. How do you stir something up?
You have to be outspoken to stir something up.
Outspoken? What kinds of things would you have to say about Paul and Barnabas to stir something up? What is the character of this group? Yeah.
Placing doubts.
Doubts? Okay. Just a little bit manipulative, right? Focusing on doubts. What else?
Can't care too much what other people think of you.
Say more about that.
Because you're gonna go outside the mainstream to a certain extent. Because if you're stirring something up, it's not going right now. You're trying to start something different. So you're willing to step out of whatever that normal is to say, hey, this isn't normal. You can change that.
A little bit of a boldness,
If you care what people think, you don't do that.
maybe self-righteousness. I'm not sure what else to say about that. Boldness, maybe? Okay, what else? Tell me about the character of this group. If we're writing this group as a personality, what else is happening? Are they saying truthful things about Paul and Barnabas? Think?
Probably both. Truth mixed with lies.
Okay,
They were divided. There were believers and there were unbelievers.
divided. What happens when you have a divided crowd?
You have fear.
You have fear. What else do you have? When a crowd is divided,
You have discord.
discord, what does that mean?
Unstable.
Unstable, what else? Us versus them.
Each goes their own direction.
Now we're in a fight, right? Yes,
Also fighting over what's true, what they think is true. So they're
What?
fighting over what the truth is.
so they're fighting over the truth. Anything else about this crowd that you can imagine? Are they churchgoers? Are they, what do you think?
Well, they were in the synagogue, so yes, both the unbelieving and the believing were there. So
So they knew, they knew the synagogue, they knew God, they knew of the rules, they were educated. Anything else about this group? All right, group one, we've got this character here, fighting over the truth, a confusing group. Let's talk about group two. Where do we find the next group of people in this passage? And if they were a character, what would they look like? We've got the crippled man, he's healed. We move ahead and verse 11, when the crowd. Tell me about this crowd. Group number two, if we're writing them as a character, what would we write? What happened to them?
they're definitely not Jewish. They believe these men are gods, pagan.
Pagan, okay? Is it polytheistic, right? There's more than one God, right? What else do we know about them? What else? What would it have taken for them to do what they did?
The priests of the temple. If I understand it right, because they wanted to make them part of their gods.
Okay, so they had
So
some,
there'd be a win if they can pull these guys into where, you know, they're leaders. They kind of join the group. Oh, look, we win.
so they had some sort of structure, they were some sort of priests, right? And in that culture, would that have implied leadership?
Yeah.
Okay. What else do we know about this group?
Suggest they're fat and happy.
Why? Tell me more about that.
Well, it's after they tell them to go away from their gods and they're talking about the living God who made the heaven and earth. He said he's not left himself without testimony. He's shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their seasons. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy. So that and happy.
And we also see them bringing sacrifices, right? They clearly had something to bring. Yes,
They're changeable, and that changeability occupies real extremes. Like, let's either sacrifice to these people as gods or kill them. There's not a lot of moderation. They seem to be able to move between those two things pretty
they
rapidly.
switch their perspectives pretty, they do, don't they? They can change their minds, right?
what's the word for that?
Pliable, maybe.
Volatile.
Emotional.
They're pliable to a certain point, though. You notice that, right? Then what happened? They got a little mad when they got called out. Okay, what else do we know about them? Are they in an urban area, rural area? My readings this week imply that they're in a rural area. These are not the big, like in the middle of Rome kind of people. So they're a bit rural.
So
Maybe.
They came in from outside the cities
Yeah.
initially, so they are a small town, or at least it's.
Maybe Walla Walla, maybe Waitsburg, maybe, you know, yes.
We say pliable because at the end it says the Jews came down and convinced them of other things and they finally stoned Paul. But at the beginning, they seem very convinced that they are gods in human form. Because back in verse 18, even with these words, they had trouble keeping the crowd from sacrificing to them. So the crowd seems to be very, we know what's going on here and we want to do this for you.
I'm not a historian. There are those in this room that will know more about this, but I did find this week that this crowd was particularly thinking about some poetry that had been written in their region by a poet named Ovid. And there was a tradition or a lore or a myth in their area that the gods, Zeus and Hermes, that the gods impersonated human beings and tried to visit parts of their region and were rebuffed until a nice old couple said, yeah, you can come in. And the gods were angry at everyone that had rebuffed them but the old couple and sent a flood into this region and destroyed everybody but this couple. So this crowd, according to historians, would have seen that, would have known that, and they were particularly attuned to, all right, we better not let that happen because we have this suspicion because of this myth. Because of, we've heard this story, we've heard what happens if the gods show up, we won't know who they are, we better be nice. Did I get that right, historians? I think I did. So what does that imply about what they would have been thinking when Paul and Barnabas show up? Yes.
Well, they're doing this out of fear based on that story, because it, without that context, it looks like they want to serve these men because of the miracle, but if it's because of that, it's, we don't want to get punished by the gods for missing these human versions of them.
Fear of the mythology, right? We've heard, we think this happened. Yes.
This, to me, this is the classic description of paganism, the appeasement of an angry god. That's whether it's Baal or any of the gods, they would always have to sacrifice to them to keep them happy, including their children.
Let's talk about the gods for a minute. We'll take a little side trip. I've written the two gods. You notice that they decided that Paul was Hermes and Barnabas was Zeus. If you want to take a little side trip, you could chat GPT or Google who was Zeus and who was Hermes. Does anybody know? Does anyone want to shout out?
Zeus was king of the gods.
King of the gods, okay. What else? What else do we know? Yes,
Well, they're king of the gods, but they're also brothers. And Hermes is the god of the underworld, so
I think father, son, right?
the father, son, but they're brothers.
Hades is,
Oh,
I don't know. Okay, what
Hermes
else
is
do
the
we know?
messenger, I believe.
Pardon?
Hermes is the messenger of the
Hermes
gods.
is a messenger, yes. In my reading this week, Hermes is related to, wait, it's kind of interesting, roads and travel and sending
He has
messages.
wings on his ankles.
Wings on his ankles? What does that mean? You always tell the truth. Trickster,
According to Google, Hermes is Zeus' son.
okay? Can you imagine going on a mission trip and being mistaken for Zeus or Hermes? Let that sink in. What else do we know? What else can you surmise? If they're thinking that Zeus, king of the gods,
This means Barnabas was quite a bit older than Paul. Because they figured out, well, there's the Father and there's the Son, so. It must have been a generational.
Or maybe Paul did all the talking.
Yeah, but we all know God's old with a beard.
Yeah.
So was Zeus.
So this crowd says, hey, we remember this poetry, we remember this mythology, this myth. Oh dear, now we've got two people here among us. And one appears to be preaching. Okay, this seems slightly suspicious. So they decide that Paul and Barnabas are gods, right? They
What?
pull out all the stops, yeah.
I mean, look at the miracle for a minute. This man was born lame. A person that's born lame, the legs never develop. They're tiny and spindly. So, you know, and they're crooked. And for this person with born lame to stand up and walk on command, now that's a remarkable miracle. I can't hardly understand it.
What would you have done if that had happened in your presence?
I mean,
What would you have done?
everybody knew this person, you know, everybody had seen this cripple. He was always going around town in his wheelchair and to see this. So I don't think it was just looking at these people. I think that was a real miracle.
Yes.
Well, I'm looking at the difference between how Jews reacted to miracles versus pagans. Pagans tend to go really fast to, you must be something really incredible to do this miracle, and they want to fall at their feet. Versus Jews, they either think they came from God and they want him to be the Messiah or some great prophet, or they want to kill him because he must be using the power of demons. Because he's speaking against God, so therefore the magic must not be from God. So it's a very different reaction.
Interesting point. Yes.
I think what strikes me about this section is that how our tendency to have tolerance if something fits in our worldview, or we try and fit something in our worldview, but we have pretty quick intolerance if we can't fit it into our worldview.
Where does that come from? Where do you think that comes from? Tough question, right? How we understand the world and how we discern new things.
Depends on where you go for your truth.
Okay, say more about that.
You know, sometimes if someone, especially more recently, says, well, I don't know, you know, that's a fact. And if I say, well, where did you learn that? Or where did you hear that? And if they tell me a certain source, I say, okay, end of discussion. If that's their truth, then you know, anything I say isn't going to make a difference. So it depends on where you go for your truth, as to what you listen to, what you hear, what you're receptive to.
How do you feel about this group and how they reacted when Paul and Barnabas said, we are not gods? We're not we're not who you think we are. That's kind of they tried to stone them, right? What?
If you're not gods, then you're fakes. You tried to fool us. Or you did think, you know, and of course, it wasn't their fault, but they, in essence, they had, well, we thought you were gods and you're not. We're done with you.
Kind of an indignant,
Yeah,
this is not what I, yeah.
they blamed them, not themselves. How dare you fake gods to us? How dare you make us think you were gods?
They didn't take the personal responsibility, yes.
Well, but it says that the Jews from Antioch and Iconium came and started to spread a whole different picture. And now they're swinging over the other way. So it sounds like they were easily persuaded either way. And they went finally the way to stone.
All right, let's move to group number 3. We find group number 3 starting at about, let's see, 21. Verse 21. Talk to me about group number 3. You had to write a character for group number 3, what would that character be like?
First of all, I think it's very remarkable that anyone who had been stoned in a place, left for dead, went away, and then came back to that very place to say, oh, here, let me talk to these people some more. Who does that? Yeah.
I do wanna talk about that, cause Paul and Barnabas, they went right back, they retraced their steps. This wasn't like, hey, you guys weren't nice to us, we're gonna go find someplace that is nice. This was, we've gotta go back there, cause we have more to do after they stoned us.
This section, they appear though to be going to the believers that have accepted a good picture, encouraging, giving, appointing elders, and other building up the faith.
Okay,
Towards the return trip.
say more about this group.
Think they were seekers?
Seekers, okay? Uh-oh, my eraser's not working so good. Okay, so I'm heading back.
They fit a profile of early adopters. Both your last two groups are wanting to maintain a trajectory in the direction of where they have been raised, a product of their social environment. And group 3 is willing to extend itself outside of what has been their norm up until this point. So they are hearing something new, they're seeing value in it, and they're starting to join a fellow group of individuals who are practicing something similar. So they're looking for community, but it's community outside of basically becoming pariahs from their own last two groups.
Well, yes,
Well, it says, they were appointing elders in every church, but it doesn't say synagogue. So I feel like we've gone out of the realm of in the countryside, in the temples, in the synagogues, and we've gone to churches, which may have meant houses at this time, so they're meeting, it seems like they might be meeting in a different place.
could it be that they're not as tied to traditional religion? You know, could it be that they're a little more, their worship can happen wherever? Maybe,
Contemporary.
yes, I see a hand.
It could be that they're trying to avoid the places with the people who want to stone them. That's what the synagogues were.
Seems reasonable, right? I mean, if I figured I was gonna be stoned over there today, I'm not sure I would go over there. Right? So maybe safety was a concern. What else do we know about this group? What do we know? Why would Paul and Barnabas go back to them? Why would they go back there? Yeah.
Well, I'm gonna just say, we know the names of 3 of them. Lois, Eunice, and Timothy.
I think it's LOIS, right?
Yes. So at least 2/3 of them were women.
You've been out on a 2-year journey. You've gone 1,400 miles. You've been stoned, threatened to be stoned. You've been called gods, sort of run out of town, and you go back, and this is home base in this story. Why would that be?
They're sponges.
Pardon?
Sponges. They want to soak up everything.
They had an interest. Clearly, Paul and Barnabas wanted to go tell them what happened, right? Okay, what else?
That they were fasting and praying, so they were getting serious about following God and Jesus.
I find that interesting. It doesn't say that, I mean, we appointed elders and so forth, but it doesn't say that there were priests. It doesn't say that they had created a church building. It doesn't say, you know, these folks were fasting and praying. Yes.
I mean, they're also following some of the same things they've been doing in their own religion. There are priests in the other religions, they are elders and such, there's a religious structure, so some of it, I mean, there's also gonna be prayer and fasting in your previous experiences as well. So some of it might be trying to systematize their experience of this new religion that they're experiencing.
Kind of a new building, new structure, new organization kind of thing, early organization. I've only witnessed organizations being born. I don't know that I've ever been there at ground zero. How many of you been there at ground zero when something started? What's that like? Yes, I see your hand next. What's that like when you're there at ground zero? You don't really know. Yes.
Well, and that makes me think of a group, like a volunteering group club thing that I was in that we were starting. And I'm remembering where we started versus where we went. It was very few people, very unorganized, very last minute trying to throw things together compared to later. It was like, oh, we have a system, we have support, we have friends, we have an order to do things. So maybe this group is trying to, it's small, like you said, they're small cities and they're not even these big groups, they're little groups in those small places, so they're very probably separate from each other.
I saw your hand and then I see a couple hands over here.
I think that Paul, I mean, you talk about being like Christ. I don't know, I mean, in Galatians, he says, I didn't learn this from anyone. After hearing this, I went into the desert, you know, and the Lord taught me himself for 3 years. I mean, this is a man who's been so radically changed by the power of Jesus Christ and the gospel that he goes to incredible extents to be stoned, to work through the division, to become like the Jews of Jews, to the Gentiles of Gentiles, to those with the law like the law, to those without the law. And at the end of this, I mean, you can tell in his other gospels in Corinthians, he's like, I am laboring as childbirth for you. I mean, he's willing to die for these people. You have to realize, like, why does he come back? Like, he doesn't care. He's like, to be absent from this body is to be present. Like, he's like, when it's my time, this is Paul's attitude throughout his gospels. Like, it's my time. And Paul is so sold out for sharing the love of Christ and radically changing. You have to realize, so I had a friend who just came out of a pretty openly cultic denomination. And it's interesting, even though his whole life people had brought up how his founder had committed incredibly gross atrocities. We all have a bias. We all have a bias because we don't want to believe, wait, have I been deceived? Have I been a part of a cult? Have I been a part? Like, no, you know, and it was so hard. And so I think in his early stages, I remember I've tried to talk to him many times just to make sure, like, I'm so excited that he's taking these steps out, but I want to go back to him over and over and over to make sure that he stays grounded in the faith that he first received. And so I keep trying to talk to him as often as I can about getting him centered on the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that way he doesn't slip back or find atheism. And I think that here you have this early believing group on fire for Jesus Christ. And Paul's like, man, like all of this stoning for nothing, that here's a group of believers. Of course, he's going to go focus his time where that is. And of course, from that sprang the entire gospel from these little church plants, you know, that we're recipients of this ministry that they did. Anyway, it's just a heart that is transformed by Jesus. This is what it causes you to do.
This is for Paul. This is the seed.
This is the finality. This is incredible.
I'm watering. Yes.
So I was thinking in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and we baptize people into the church per se, and then very often, they made it. You know, I got it. And we move on. And yet the example here is to go back and encourage that faith, like he's talking about.
Tend it.
We need to tend it, to have it grow, get it a sounder, deeper picture that we can teach so that they'll never walk away from it. Because it is true.
Which, you know, the recipients were clearly ready for them to come back, right? Fasting and praying. So we have 15 minutes left. And we talked about Paul, and we've taken a little bit of a hard turn away from Paul and focused on some group characters. So now I want to ask you a couple of questions. How do we take what we read in chapter 14 about these groups? And how do we understand these groups with a concept similar to the wisdom of crowds? You ever heard that phrase? The wisdom of crowds. What does that mean? The wisdom of crowds. When you hear that, what is that referring to?
Foolishness of crowds. It sounds sarcastic.
sort of. The idea of the wisdom of crowds is what? Yes.
If everybody's going to a restaurant, it's not bad.
The wisdom of crowds says the more minds coming together, potentially the better the outcome, right? Sort of the concept. There's books written about this. The wisdom of crowds. There are studies on this. If you throw an incredibly complex problem out and you put a few people in the room, they tend to get closer to the answer than someone isolated, right? The wisdom of crowds. How do we relate to crowd one, crowd two, and crowd three when we think about the concept of the wisdom of crowds, which I think is going more towards the point that was made over here is we have a specific worldview, right? And we're constantly trying to discern that worldview and what that means for us and what we should do. Based on what we read here, how would you navigate the concept of the wisdom of crowds? What was the difference between crowd one, crowd two, and crowd three? Yes.
Idea of confirmation bias that was talked about earlier, that you want to consume more of what you already believe, leads me to believe that you could never underestimate the power of stupid people in large groups. Because they're going to hear what they want to hear.
Okay, yes.
Seems like group one was kind of more protecting themselves. Right? They kind of didn't accept new things. Crowd two overly accepted everything. Anything just became part of their framework and reference. And then crowd three was the crowd that was willing to listen, right? Be more open and just learn versus either reject or accept right away. Just be willing to sit and absorb what was being said.
Both one and two end up acting against these two individuals and their message by stirring up fear from a position of credibility. And in the second group, these folks didn't have to believe the same religious, they weren't like with the Jews trying to protect their own religion, but it took the Jews coming from the other city and saying to them, oh, no, these guys are wrong. Don't lump them in with us. And because they were known and they had at least some familiarity or credibility, they could other Paul and Barnabas and turn the crowd kind of against them and create that fear. I think that I don't know. I look at it and I think, that there's people in positions of authority and credibility that have incredible power to really thwart the thinking or the movement of a crowd in what might otherwise be the right direction.
So power and credibility does not equal sound advice, is kind of what you're saying. All right, here and then there and then there.
I think in group two, wisdom of crowds turned into more of mob mentality. From at the beginning, maybe it was good from one side, oh, these guys are important, we need to worship them. But then someone came in and gave a negative aspect and they all swayed that direction and ended up stoning.
Well, in mob mentality, I think by definition, I looked it up a couple of years ago. I think by definition, mob mentality is where, because you're in a group, you would act in a way that you wouldn't normally act. The group sort of takes on the dynamic. The group dictates how you're going to behave. Mob mentality kind of supersedes your own personal responsibility and ability to engage. Yes.
I would, well, mine's maybe simplistic, but I would actually say group 1 and 2 are actually very identical and similar. Group 1 has a fixed idea of what religion and God, who God should be. Group 2 has a fixed idea of who their gods and religions should be. Group 3 is wanting to learn about the new character of God, the character of God revealed through Jesus in the gospel.
Okay, is that accurate? How you're thinking? Yes.
Mine's actually along the lines of Glenn there. It's to me, it's to a certain degree about control. It's some clarity of the cloud in terms of control. The first group wants control of the group. And when they don't like what the apostles are saying, they start fighting them. As long as the apostles are saying what they want them to say, they like them, but then they start to debate and argue. The second group love their power. They want control of power. The gods are with them. They can harness the power of the gods to their benefit. When they say, no, we're not gods, and this is about the gospel and about God, they said, no, now we're against you. Because the control of power was not with the people that they're trying to, put on a pedestal, whereas the third group is giving control to the gospel. They're giving themselves to a greater cause, to the love of God and the gospel truth.
To that end, group 1 and group 2 are willing to do bodily and physical harm to hold on to control, right? Is group 3 in that boat?
They're fasting, so they're only hurting their own body.
They're fasting and they're praying here and then there. Yes.
Mob mentality happened because we believe in the wisdom of crowd. If we didn't believe in the wisdom of crowds, mob mentality wouldn't exist. And that's the terrible thing about truth, because there's always a little bit of truth that causes false beliefs. We believe that the crowd might be right, so we follow the crowd even when it goes against our own conscience. Well, they must have more information. They must know something I don't. To the point where we don't even believe obvious things that we have in our heads. So I think the important thing about wisdom of crowds is it's only wisdom of crowds if it also agrees with your own moral compass.
Mob mentality is kind of like peer pressure.
Yeah, I think Malcolm and Glenn are onto something here that I've been thinking about the last hour too, which is the first two groups are static. They're fixed. The last group, the word that's used in that last group in the text is disciple, which is learning, which is dynamic, which is moving. And I think this can feel counterintuitive to us. But it is true that God never changes and he's always on the move at the same time. And I think that the safest place is in the dynamic space, but disciple also has a fixed point of reference, and that's Jesus. So it's not just willy-nilly wandering about just changing things, but it's always on the move. And I think a sure danger for us as individuals and for our institutions is if we never change. We're fixed. And a sheer recipe for success and faithfulness is getting up out of your chair, moving, changing, but always keeping your eyes on Jesus. And I think that is, so I think, again, Glenn and Malcolm, I think are really onto something there, that is the biggest difference I see here is movement, but it's movement with faithfulness. And I think in Hebrews 11 and 12, you get this in spades, right? A whole series of examples, the cloud of witnesses, all of which are on the move, all of which are, and then, the great finish there by the author of Hebrews, keep your eyes fixed on who? On Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith. So I think the danger for us is that we shift in our definition, Jody, I think from a definition of disciple is sort of just doing fixed things. And then that's where the danger comes. And you see that both in the Jewish and the Gentile communities there. So I think that's a pretty powerful sort of lesson that you brought out in this chapter is that distinction.
Yeah, I see two hands and then I'm gonna ask you a question. Yes.
It seems group 3 is open to present truth. I think it's
Open,
good way to put it.
okay? Anthony, I saw your hand.
I think the fixed framework of the view of who their God or gods is tends to limit what the possibilities of worship or expression tend to be in the first two are fairly certain of who God is. The third is curious of who God is. And I think you see a similar kind of trajectory happen where Jesus returns to basically say, maybe something hasn't always been right about how we thought who God was. And there's a development in understanding God as infinite as opposed to finite. And the first two are confident that God is a certain way. And the third is willing to explore what is God like? Could he be more than what we've thought? Is there more beyond our understanding of who God is?
So as I was reading this passage this week, I'm certainly not Paul. I'm not going on a giant journey. I hope I will never be stoned, right? I hope, I don't know. I'm certainly not Paul. I don't really feel Barnabas. But I found myself wondering, am I a crowd member in this story? And which one would I be? And how would I act? And this is my final question. We're close to the end. Where do you think it went off the rails for the people in Lystra? Paul and Barnabas fled Iconium, went to Lystra, and they hung out there for a while. Paul makes a lovely sermon about the God of the universe, the maker of earth, the God that provides rains, and the people of Lystra are like, you guys are amazing. We're gonna sacrifice animals to you. We have wreaths. We're having a whole celebration. This is not antisocial behavior. This is, you're amazing, and we also think you're gods. Where do you think they went off the rails? They were certainly welcoming, right? They were certainly open, yes.
Relating that in my thinking, that first one says fighting over the truth. Because this is still a battle that they'd be having, and my thought process goes to 1888. We had Wagner Jones, who presented a certain picture. We voted against it. According to Ellen White, she says we voted wrongly. She describes it in a couple of places very plainly. That makes us have to look at what is truth. And I like my pastor describes it's growth. It changes. We need to look at it. And I'm not sure they were willing to look at it unless.
Yes.
Fear of change, fear of willing to look at their beliefs and accept something new that they found.
I was trying to imagine this week. Can you imagine putting someone up on a pedestal, sacrificing expensive livestock, right? Making wreaths, having the whole shebang, only for them to say, no. I'm just like you. I'm just like you, but there's someone else that's amazing. Let me tell you about that. And then being so angry, so in that moment, being so upset that you were going to stone them for correcting you, for saying, no, it's not me.
It's hard to be corrected.
It's the God. Yeah, I found myself wondering, well, how would I react? Would I be like running you out of town? Yes, couple more hands and then I see 1, 2, 3. Yep. Nope. Okay.
So here it says, after they were telling them they're not gods and telling them about the God of heaven and everything, it says, even with these words, they had difficulty keeping the crowd from sacrificing to them. It's not until the Jews from Antioch and Iconium come and win the crowd over that they stone Paul and drag him outside of the city. It wasn't their words. It wasn't their correction. It was the Jews coming from Iconium and Antioch that won the crowd over and turned them against Paul.
Yes.
I look at it from the standpoint of we can get excited about something, but a paradigm shift is hard. And when a paradigm shift is forced upon us, we get angry. We just, I don't know if I can swallow this. I can be excited about something that fits my zone, my paradigm, but if you're gonna tell me I have to shift my paradigm, maybe I'm ready to be angry.
And maybe even my cultural norm, right? Yes,
I was gonna say what Jared said.
okay, yes.
Yeah, exactly.
We're on the same page.
I thought it was an interesting parallel to see similar like a crowd mentality when Jesus feeds the multitude and they say, this is it. And he goes, stop, go away, and retreats. And following Jesus, so to speak, doesn't necessarily mean being on the path. And I think that it's something specific.
I found myself asking myself this week and Lois, if you could pray us out at the end, that would be great. But I found myself asking myself this week, how quick am I to dial in and lock in? How quick am I to dial in and lock in? And what does it take to dislodge me and how would I act? I can throw a little fussy fit. Jerry will probably tell you. I can be upset. I can be upset if things, irritate me.
Siblings.
I just wondered, where would I be in these crowds? And how do I know that there aren't crowds now? God doesn't stop moving. He doesn't, just because the Bible stops at a certain point doesn't mean God's done. So that has been my worship over the week and my prayer. Lois, would you pray us out?
Dear God, this week we want to live as disciples of Jesus Christ in group 3. Amen.
Have a really good Sabbath. There's potluck today, Saltworks and theology class in the fellowship hall.